When the steel doors of San Quentin State Prison slammed shut behind David Goggins at exactly 3:47 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon, he had no idea that the next 72 hours would test everything he thought he knew about true mental toughness, and that his real education was about to begin. The wrongful arrest had been a nightmare cascade of mistaken identity, faulty witness testimony, and a justice system that moved faster than facts could catch up. One moment he was finishing his morning run along the San Diego coastline, the next he was being processed into one of America's most notorious maximum security facilities while his lawyers scrambled to untangle a bureaucratic mess that would take days to resolve. But what the system didn't anticipate, what the inmates couldn't have predicted, and what David Goggins himself was about to discover, was that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even when it's the last place you want to be. The intake process had stripped away everything that defined David Goggins to the outside world. No more book deals, no more speaking engagements, no more social media following that hung on his every word about mental toughness and overcoming adversity. Just another number in an orange jumpsuit walking through corridors that echoed with the sounds of desperation and barely contained violence. "Fresh meat," someone called out as David was escorted to his temporary cell in C Block. The voice carried that particular blend of amusement and menace that only came from men who had nothing left to lose and all day to think about it. David Goggins had faced hostile environments before. Navy SEAL training had been designed to break him. Ultramarathons had pushed his body beyond what should have been survivable. But this was different. This wasn't voluntary suffering with a clear endpoint. This was involuntary confinement with predators who viewed newcomers as either prey or entertainment. The first night taught him that everything he thought he knew about mental toughness was about to be recalibrated. "You that motivation guy?" The voice came from the cell next to his around 2 a.m., when the prison settled into its restless version of sleep. "My sister follows your Instagram. Says you're all about that stay hard bullshit." David recognized the tone. It was the same dismissive skepticism he'd encountered from civilians who thought military training was just an act, from athletes who believed ultrarunning was more publicity stunt than genuine achievement. "I'm just trying to get through this like everyone else," David replied, keeping his voice level. A laugh echoed through the darkness. "Nah, man. You ain't like everyone else. You're a celebrity. And celebrities don't last long in here unless they prove they're about that life." But what David discovered the next morning would change his entire perspective on what it meant to survive. The yard at San Quentin was a concrete amphitheater of human hierarchies and unspoken rules. Groups clustered by race, by crime, by length of sentence, by affiliations that had been forged in blood and maintained through fear. David walked out alone, which in prison currency was either suicidal confidence or naive stupidity. That's when he met Marcus "Tank" Williams. Tank was a monument to what the human body could become when it had nothing to do but build muscle and rage for 15 years. 6'4", 280 pounds of prison-forged steel, with arms that looked like they could tear phone books in half and a stare that suggested he'd done far worse to human beings. "So you the tough guy?" Tank said, approaching with 3 other inmates flanking him like satellites around a dangerous planet. "Navy SEAL, ultramarathon runner, all that internet warrior shit." The yard had gone quiet in the way that predators fall silent when they sense blood in the water. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Basketball games paused. Even the guards seemed to lean forward with interest. "I'm just trying to do my time," David said. "Nah, see, that's where you got it wrong," Tank replied, closing the distance until he was close enough that David could smell the mixture of prison soap and something more primal. "Time don't just get done in here. Time gets earned. And you ain't earned shit yet." Here's where everything changed in a way that David Goggins never could have anticipated. "You want to know what real hard is?" Tank continued, his voice carrying across the yard like he was giving a sermon. "Real hard is getting sentenced to life when you're 19 years old. Real hard is watching your daughter grow up through pictures your baby mama sends maybe twice a year. Real hard is knowing that the last conversation you had with your mother was a fight, and now she's dead, and you can't even go to her funeral." The words hit David like physical blows, not because they were meant as attacks, but because they carried the weight of absolute truth. You made a choice to be a SEAL, Tank said. You chose to run those races. You chose to push yourself. Every single thing you did that made you famous, that made you money, that made people respect you, you chose it all. Tank gestured around the yard, taking in the concrete walls, the razor wire, the armed guards and towers. We didn't choose shit. We surviving what got chosen for us. So before you start talking about mental toughness in here, you better understand that we've been living it since we was kids, and we didn't get no book deals for it. The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear the wind moving through the razor wire above them. Every eye in that yard was on him, waiting to see how the celebrity would handle being stripped down to his most essential self. But what David said next would shock everyone within hearing distance. You're absolutely right. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an explosion that everyone felt but nobody had seen coming. I did choose my hard, David continued, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. And every time it got too difficult, I had an exit strategy. I had people cheering for me. I had rewards waiting on the other side. He looked directly at Tank, then let his gaze sweep across the other inmates who had gathered to watch what they expected to be a humiliation. But y'all been doing life sentences in your own heads since you were kids. Foster care, abuse, neighborhoods where survival meant becoming something you never wanted to be. And when the system finally caught up to you, they locked you in cages and told you to reform yourselves with no tools, no support, and no hope. Wait until you see what Tank did next. For a moment that seemed to stretch into geological time, Tank stared at David with an expression that was impossible to read. The muscle in his jaw worked like he was chewing something too tough to swallow. His hands, which had been clenched into fists the size of bowling balls, slowly relaxed. So what you saying, Navy boy? Tank asked, but his voice had lost some of its edge. I'm saying maybe we can learn from each other. You show me what real survival looks like, and maybe I show you some techniques for turning that survival instinct into something that builds instead of just endures. Tank's laugh was short and bitter. You think you can fix us with your motivation speeches? I think you're already fixed, David replied. Any man who can survive 15 years in here without losing his mind is already stronger than 99% of the people on the outside. The question is, what are you going to do with that strength? The conversation that followed would reshape David's entire understanding of what it meant to overcome adversity. All right, motivation man, Tank said after a long moment. You want to see what real hard looks like? Meet us in the yard after count time. We'll show you how we work out in here. That evening, as the sun began its descent behind the concrete walls of San Quentin, David discovered that everything he thought he knew about physical training was about to be completely revolutionized by men who had transformed their cells into laboratories for human performance. The prison workout that Tank and his crew demonstrated looked nothing like the gym routines David was familiar with. This was functional strength forged from necessity and creativity. Pull-ups from cell bars. Push-ups with a man sitting on your back. Squats with another human being draped across your shoulders like a barbell made of flesh and bone. We don't got fancy equipment, Tank explained as he effortlessly performed one-arm push-ups that would have challenged elite military personnel. So we make equipment out of whatever we got, including each other. David watched in fascination as inmates whose society had written off as failures demonstrated levels of physical conditioning that would have impressed Olympic trainers. These men had taken the most restrictive environment imaginable and turned it into a forge for human potential. Your turn, SEAL boy, Tank said, gesturing to a workout station that had been improvised from bedsheets, concrete blocks, and human ingenuity. But what happened when David attempted their routine would humble him in ways that Hell Week never had. The movements were designed by people who understood leverage, physics, and biomechanics not through textbooks but through years of experimentation with their own bodies as the primary laboratory equipment. Every exercise served multiple purposes, building strength while maintaining sanity, developing power while working within the constraints of confinement. David's first attempt at their signature routine left him gasping after 10 minutes. Men who hadn't been outside these walls in decades were outlasting a Navy SEAL who had built his reputation on superior conditioning. Different kind of hard, ain't it? Tank observed with something that might have been amusement. Different and better, David admitted between ragged breaths. You've figured out how to maximize results with minimal resources. That's actually genius. The word genius had probably never been applied to Tank Williams in any official capacity. He dropped out of school in 8th grade, been in and out of juvenile facilities since he was 12, and had his life effectively ended by a justice system that specialized in disposal rather than development. But watching him analyze movement patterns and adjust techniques with the precision of a biomechanics professor, David realized that prison had done something that no university could have accomplished. It had given Tank unlimited time to perfect his craft with complete focus and zero distractions. Genius, Tank repeated, like he was tasting the word for the first time. Nobody ever called me that before. That's because people on the outside don't understand what you've built in here, David said. They see the crime, the conviction, the jumpsuit. They don't see the laboratory. Here's what neither of them expected to happen next. Over the following days, as David's legal team worked frantically to resolve his case, something unprecedented began developing in C Block. Word had spread about the celebrity inmate who didn't act like a celebrity, who treated convicted felons like they had something valuable to teach him. Inmates who normally wouldn't speak to outsiders began approaching David with their own innovations. Carlos, serving 25 to life for gang-related charges, had developed a meditation technique that helped him manage rage. Jerome, in for armed robbery, had taught himself to read and was working his way through philosophy texts that would have challenged graduate students. You know what nobody talks about, Jerome said during one of their evening conversations. How much time we got in here to actually think. Really think. Without distractions, without bullshit, without anything but you and your thoughts for years at a time. David nodded. He'd experienced something similar during his longest ultramarathons, when external stimulation disappeared and you were left with nothing but your own mental processes for company. Some guys go crazy from it, Jerome continued. But some of us, we figure things out. We solve problems. We become different people than we were when we came in. Different how? Stronger. Not just physically. Mentally. Spiritually. We had to rebuild ourselves from nothing, with nothing, while everyone on the outside assumed we were just rotting away. But what Jerome said next would become the catalyst for everything that followed. The problem is, nobody believes that transformation is possible. Not the guards, not the parole boards, not society. They see us as what we did on our worst day, not what we became during our best years. David felt something shift in his understanding of justice, redemption, and human potential. What if we could change that? He heard himself asking. Change what? The perception. What if we could show people on the outside what you've built in here? What if we could prove that this place produced something more than just time served? Tank, who had been listening from his usual position leaning against the concrete wall, straightened up. You talking about some kind of program? I'm talking about documentation. Proof. Evidence that the men in here have developed skills, knowledge, and strength that the outside world desperately needs. The idea that began forming in that conversation would eventually revolutionize approaches to prison rehabilitation, but first it had to survive the test of practical application. All right, motivation man, Tank said after a long moment. You want to prove we're more than what they think we are? Let's do it right. What Tank proposed next would create the most intense 48-hour period of David Goggins' life. We create a challenge. Not just physical, but mental. Something that tests everything: endurance, problem-solving, leadership, teamwork. We document every minute of it. And when you get out of here, you show the world what we're really capable of. The challenge Tank designed was unlike anything David had encountered in military training or civilian competition. It combined physical tasks that maximized prison resources with mental puzzles that drew on the collective intelligence of men who had spent years with nothing to do but think. Stage 1. a 24-hour endurance test using only bodyweight exercises and improvised equipment. Teams of 4 inmates rotating through stations designed to test not just individual strength but group coordination. Stage 2. Problem-solving scenarios based on real survival situations. How do you create tools from limited resources? How do you maintain morale when hope seems impossible? How do you lead when everyone has reasons not to follow? Stage 3. Teaching challenges. Each participant had to successfully transfer a skill to someone else within a limited time frame. Physical techniques, mental strategies, even academic subjects that inmates had taught themselves. The catch, Tank explained, is that it all gets recorded. Every success, every failure, every moment when someone wants to quit. No editing, no highlighting the good parts. Just truth. David realized that Tank had essentially designed a comprehensive assessment of human potential under extreme constraints. It was more sophisticated than most corporate leadership training programs, more demanding than military evaluation protocols. When do we start? David asked. Right now. But what happened during those 48 hours would challenge every assumption David had made about strength, intelligence, and human capacity. The physical challenges alone were revelatory. Watching men in their 40s and 50s perform feats of strength and endurance that would have impressed professional athletes, David began to understand that prison had accidentally created one of the most intense training environments possible. Jerome, the philosophy reader, demonstrated a pull-up technique that incorporated principles of leverage he'd learned from engineering textbooks. Carlos performed meditation-assisted endurance challenges that drew on practices he'd developed to survive solitary confinement. Tank orchestrated group exercises that required the kind of precise coordination that Navy SEAL teams spent months developing. But the mental challenges revealed something even more extraordinary. These men had developed problem-solving abilities that came from years of having to improvise solutions with minimal resources. They could create functional tools from materials that others would consider garbage. They could analyze complex situations with the kind of clarity that only came from having unlimited time to think without distraction. You see what we did here? Tank asked during a brief break in the challenges. We turned the worst environment in America into a university. We just didn't have any teachers except each other, and no degrees except survival. David was beginning to understand that he hadn't been randomly thrown into prison by bureaucratic error. He'd been given a masterclass in human adaptation that no civilian program could have provided. Wait until you see what happened when the guards started paying attention. Correctional Officer Davis had been working at San Quentin for 12 years, and he thought he'd seen everything that inmates could devise to pass time, cause trouble, or break regulations. But the organized challenges happening in C Block were something entirely different. Instead of the usual territorial disputes, contraband trafficking, and violence that characterized prison yard dynamics, Davis was observing what looked like an intensive training program. Inmates were pushing each other to improve rather than competing for dominance. They were teaching skills instead of settling scores. What exactly is going on out there? Davis asked David during one of the routine cell checks. Education, David replied simply. Education in what? Human potential. Davis had been a corrections officer long enough to be skeptical of anything that sounded like rehabilitation rhetoric. He'd watched too many programs come and go, seen too many inmates manipulate systems designed to help them. But he'd also worked C Block long enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted in the energy of the unit. These men are teaching me things I never learned in the military, David continued. They're demonstrating levels of mental toughness that I built my career talking about, but they're living it without any of the support systems or recognition that I had. And what are you teaching them? That what they've developed in here has value. That survival skills can become leadership skills. That the world needs what they've learned, even if the world doesn't know it yet. Here's what CO Davis witnessed next that would change his entire perspective on corrections. During one of the challenges, an inmate named Roberto serving time for assault successfully talked another participant through a panic attack using techniques he developed during his own struggles with claustrophobia and solitary confinement. The intervention was more effective than most professional crisis counseling David had witnessed. Another inmate, Marcus, not Tank, but another Marcus serving time for burglary, demonstrated an improvised physical therapy routine he'd created to help fellow inmates recover from injuries without access to proper medical care. His understanding of anatomy and recovery principles was more sophisticated than what David had learned in military medical training. "These men aren't just surviving," David explained to Davis. "They're innovating. They're creating solutions to problems that exist throughout society, but they're doing it in conditions that most people couldn't endure for a week." Davis found himself staying beyond his shift to observe the challenges, fascinated despite himself by what he was witnessing. "In 12 years of corrections work," he told David, "I've never seen anything like this. These guys are different when they're doing this stuff. Focused. Purposeful. Like they remember who they could be instead of just reacting to who they were." But what happened on the final day of David's incarceration would create ripple effects that neither he nor the inmates could have anticipated. David's lawyers had finally untangled the bureaucratic mess that had landed him in San Quentin. The paperwork was processed, the mistake was officially acknowledged, and his release was scheduled for the following morning. But instead of relief, David felt something unexpected: reluctance to leave. "Funny thing about this place," Tank observed as they completed the final challenges. "It strips away everything you think makes you special and forces you to discover what actually makes you strong." "What are you going to do with what you've built here?" David asked. "Same thing we've been doing. Survive. Improve. Try to become better than we were yesterday." "But what about when you get out?" Tank's expression hardened slightly. "Man, I got life without parole. I ain't getting out." The reality hit David like a physical blow. All of this innovation, all of this growth, all of this human potential was contained within walls that most of these men would never cross again. "Then we bring the outside to you," David said. "What do you mean?" "I mean we document what you've created. We show the world that the most innovative rehabilitation program in America wasn't designed by experts or funded by grants. It was created by men who had nothing but time and necessity." What David proposed next would eventually transform correctional philosophy across multiple states. "We create a partnership. I help you get resources, recognition, and opportunities to share what you've developed. You help me understand what real resilience looks like, and we teach it to people on the outside who need it." Tank was quiet for a long moment, processing possibilities that he'd trained himself not to consider. "You serious about this?" "Dead serious. This place accidentally created something revolutionary. You've proven that human beings can adapt, grow, and contribute under the worst possible conditions. That's not a story about crime and punishment. That's a story about transformation and potential." The handshake they exchanged felt like a treaty between two worlds that rarely acknowledged each other's existence. David Goggins walked out of San Quentin State Prison the next morning carrying more than just relief at his freedom. He carried documentation of 48 hours that had challenged every assumption he'd made about strength, intelligence, and human capacity. The video footage from the challenges, recorded on smuggled devices and official security cameras that CO Davis had strategically positioned, would eventually become the foundation for a documentary that revolutionized public perception of incarcerated individuals. But more importantly, David carried relationships with men who had taught him that his understanding of mental toughness had been incomplete. He'd built his reputation on choosing difficult challenges and succeeding through determination and preparation. Tank and his crew had built their strength by surviving unchosen challenges with no preparation, no support, and no certainty that their efforts would ever be recognized or rewarded. "Different kind of hard," David murmured to himself as he walked through the prison gates, echoing Tank's words from that first day in the yard. 6 months later, the David Goggins Foundation would launch its first Inside Out leadership program, bringing corporate executives, military leaders, and professional athletes into maximum security facilities to learn innovation, resilience, and problem-solving from men like Tank Williams. The program would reduce recidivism rates, improve prison conditions, and create opportunities for incarcerated individuals to contribute their knowledge and skills to society while serving their sentences. But the most profound impact was on David himself. He'd entered prison believing he understood what it meant to be mentally tough. He left understanding that true strength isn't about conquering challenges you choose, it's about transforming challenges that choose you. Tank Williams, serving life without parole, had taught David Goggins what it really meant to stay hard. And David Goggins had taught Tank Williams that what he'd built in the darkness could create light for others. The question wasn't whether transformation was possible in the most restrictive environments. The question was whether the outside world was ready to learn from the innovations that had been happening behind bars all along. What would you do if you discovered that your biggest challenges had accidentally become your greatest teachers? What innovations are you capable of when you have nothing but time and necessity? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the places we least expect to find wisdom.